Today our case brings us to Glencullen, a village and townland in the county of Dunleary, Rathdown in South Dublin. Here is a pub called Johnny Fox's, which most of you might be familiar with, because of the case of Annie McCarrick, who was supposedly last seen in this pub, which I think has been debunked at this stage. Johnny Fox's was built in 1798 and is renowned for being the highest pub in Ireland and is surrounded by the Dublin Mountains. You will find all types of people visiting this famous pub, from locals, tourists, famous movie stars, musicians, sports stars, TV icons, writers, royalty, politicians, world presidents and prime ministers. Patricia Furlong was a young woman at 20 years old in 1982 who grew up in Dundrum, South Dublin with her 5 siblings and parents, Charles and Eileen Furlong. She was described as a happy-go-lucky young woman and had a certain innocence about her. She enjoyed disco dancing and roller skating and going out with her close circle of friends. They all lived in a 2-bedroom house at Mulvey Park, where sleeping 3 to a bed was not uncommon in Irish households in the 80s. When Patricia left school, she got a job working as a shop assistant in the butcher's called Hafner's of Dublin, which was well renowned for its pork sausages, to where women would hide sausages in their petticoats and smuggle them over the border to Northern Ireland. Patricia had dark hair to her shoulders, sparkling eyes and smile. As I said, she had a close circle of friends and they would socialise in their local pub, the Nine Archers, which would be later known as the Corner House. On Friday the 23rd of July 1982, it was a Friday, and Patricia was all set to go out and meet up with her friends for a night out after work. After she left work at 6 p.m, she headed to the Nine Archers pub to meet up with her friends to make plans for later that night. After this, she headed home to get ready. She had a bath, did her hair and makeup, and put on a white blouse, jacket, blue skirt and white high-heeled shoes. As she made her way to meet her friends, she stopped on the street to play a game of jump rope with 2 neighbours, before she continued on her way to the pub. The walk was around 10 minutes from her house and she arrived at around 8:30 p.m. After having a few drinks in this pub, it was decided that Patricia and her friends would go to Fracken Festival in Glencullen. The festival was held back then every year. Nowadays, it is celebrated on the last Sunday of July. Fracken is a small purple berry known also as bilberries, among other names, and they can be found along hedgerows and up Ireland's boggy hillsides. They are sweetened by the summer sun and heralded as the beginning of harvest. One of the boys that were with the group did not want to go to the festival, but he did offer to drive everyone up to Glencullen and collect them afterwards at around 2 a.m, when the night would be finishing up. So when the pub closed, the group of friends arrived at Johnny Fox's at around 12:30 a.m. There were 3 summer beer tents set up outside the grounds of the pub, where most of the activities were happening. The place was packed with people, and for some it would be an all-night event. At breakfast time later that morning, hours after the last of the revellers had made their way back home to the city of Dublin, a farmer walking the fields behind Johnny Fox's pub found the body of a young woman. She was lying on her back, near naked, in the corner of a field a few hundred yards from the pub. This field was known locally as Corbett's Field. On finding the body, he phoned for the Gardaí straight away, who arrived at the scene shortly afterwards. The Gardaí found it to be a strange sight. The young woman's shoes had been removed and placed beside the body. Her white cotton blouse and jacket were tied and used as a ligature. A search by Gardaí found 17 separate items of her belongings, including clothing and items from her handbag, in 2 neat piles in an adjoining field, where she appeared to have been murdered, before her body was dragged into the more hidden adjoining field. The pathologist, when examining the body, would later testify that all clothing had been removed from the top part of the body. This was then wound into a sophisticated ligature and tied like a rope around the neck of the deceased and knotted thereon. The pathologist had to cut the ligature with a scalpel at post-mortem to remove it as it was tied so tight. There would be no finger or thumbprints or other bruises found on the neck. The cause of death would be determined as strangulation, using her own clothes, and she had also been raped. Examination of her diary did show a male fingerprint, suggesting her killer may have flicked through it before placing it on one of the piles. By early afternoon, the media had received news that a body of a young woman had been found near the Dublin mountains. It was on the radio and television news, but the Furlongs had not heard any of the announcements. They were too busy being furious that Patricia had not returned home from the night before. At that time, they did not have a house phone, and much of Patricia's friends didn't either. The most they could do was walk around the housing estate asking neighbours had they seen Patricia, and spreading the word that the family were looking for her, thinking the most they were going to be dealing with that day was giving Patricia an earful when she finally turned up. But by early afternoon their worry and anger would be turned to total devastation as a Garda car and an unmarked car arrived outside the Furlong house. 2 detectives along with the pathologist approached the front door, opened by Charles, Patricia's father. Detectives told the Furlongs about the discovery of a body and their certainty that it was Patricia. The family were immediately taken to Stepaside Garda station for interviews to help establish who Patricia was and her last known movements. Patricia's brother-in-law was taken to Loughlinstown Hospital to identify the body, and it was indeed Patricia. The family now know that their Patricia will not ever be coming home again alive. There were problems with the Garda investigation from the onset. Officers in Dublin at the time recall that there was an overwhelming response from the public request for witnesses to come forward. Hundreds of people travelled out from the city to Stepaside Garda station, where the investigation headquarters was set up. Most travelled out directly after work, and a large queue began to form. The queue grew larger and larger, and apparently there was only a few local Gardaí available to take statements. After hours of waiting, the mood in the queue grew angry, and detectives had to be called from Dublin to help clear the backlog. Several potential witnesses had left by the time the detectives arrived. But some important witnesses were interviewed, like 14-year-old Paul Regan, who was a neighbour of the Furlongs and knew Patricia well. He had been at Johnny Fox's that night and saw Patricia outside one of the beer tents, sitting on a water tank, and had walked towards her to say hello. As he got closer, he noticed that she was with a man who was dressed all in white, with dark hair and a type of quiff in the front of his hair, a bit like Shakin' Stevens, who some of you will remember. He told Gardaí that Patricia and this man were making out, and so he did not actually get to speak to her, but he did see them leave together, out of the field where the venue was being held and onto the Glencullen Road. Hours later, when Gardaí examined the area, they recovered a beer glass, again with the male fingerprint, which would never be identified. This to me makes no sense. The venue finished at 2:30 a.m. The body was discovered at 8 a.m. and a glass was still sitting there which could have belonged to anyone before Patricia was seen there or after. Evidence? I don't think so. Then there was the statement of the 2 young women who travelled to the festival with Patricia. They had both known the man described by the 14-year-old and both had sexual relations with the man in their teens. One told how he enjoyed bringing her to the point of asphyxiation. He had attacked her once in a wooded area, causing her to be very frightened. The other young woman said she suffered similar ordeals at a location on the South County Dublin coast after accepting a lift from him. Another witness recalled seeing a man running away from the direction of the field where Patricia was found. He and others drove from the festival at 2:20 a.m. and were about 3/4 of a mile from the marquees when they saw a figure running very fast down the hill towards Kiltiernan village. The young man said as they drove up behind him, he did not look back but kept running very fast. He was wearing a light-coloured jacket, around 5'11" with fair to dark hair. One of the people that queued to give a statement was Vincent Connell, an English DJ who had been working in Dublin. He was at the festival that night with his girlfriend of 6 months. He told Gardaí that he was to meet with an RTE producer. RTE is our national radio and television station. This producer had a friend in South Africa whom Vincent believed could help him find work there. He subsequently did and became for a time a famous radio DJ. Connell at the time of the murder did give a full statement, but was very angry and refused to sign it. Then when Gardaí called to his house in Terranure, he gave a second statement and again refused to sign it. But he did have an alibi, his girlfriend, who was with him the night of the murder. She told Gardaí that she and Vincent had left the venue at 12:30 a.m. and gone home to her house. His girlfriend also told them that Vincent had spotted a girl he previously had a couple of dates with and wanted to chat to her and told her he'd be back shortly. But with other statements she would state that he was only out of her sight for a few minutes at a time when he went to use the bathroom. Vincent was born to an Irish mother in London in 1951. He was an only child, well educated, articulate, and studied English. He loved music and his lifelong ambition was to become a DJ and work in radio broadcasting. He moved to Ireland in 1970 at the age of 19 with his mother, and they both lived in the Terranure area of Dublin. Vincent was self-assured and dabbled in many careers, including joining on Garda Síochána. But by 1977 he had moved back to England and settled in Liverpool. Here he joined the Merseyside police force. He was described as charming, a man that could convince and influence anyone he met. He was very charismatic, but of course this was all a facade, and one that he was not able to hold for too long, and so he was rarely able to keep a job. In less than a year in the job at Merseyside, he was asked to leave, and by 1978 he returned to Ireland. It was said he lost his job in the police because of an assault on a fellow officer. This was the first time it would be noted that Vincent had a temper and he had difficulty in controlling it. When he returned to Ireland, he became a prison officer. This job would not last either. Over the next weeks, months and years, Gardaí would try and track down more than 1,000 people who attended the festival in Glencullen in July 1982. While their main suspect was the man in white seen with Patricia, they opened files on every young man that attended the festival. No progress was made in the murder case for another 8 years until 1990. It was then that Vincent's ex-girlfriend came forward and admitted that her statement was not entirely accurate and revealed the information about the 40 minutes he had gone missing the night Patricia was murdered. She also revealed a litany of domestic abuse she had suffered under Vincent. This was still not enough for the DPP to go forward with a murder charge. By now, Vincent had returned to Ireland from South Africa after his career faltered and he divorced. He was in a new relationship and they lived together in Fairview in Dublin. In November 1989, he assaulted his new girlfriend and threatened her with a knife and attempted to strangle her. She managed to escape and fled to Fairview Garda Station to report the assault. In May 1990, Vincent was arrested by 4 detectives in the Fleet Bar in Dublin city centre. He was charged under Section 30 of the Offences Against the State Act. This law was brought in to arrest terrorists and extended to other serious crimes, which allowed for a person to be detained for questioning for 48 hours. Vincent had been tracked and monitored for months. With multiple charges against him in place, they hoped to get to the truth of what happened to Patricia and get a charge of murder along with the other charges. You see, our Vincent was no saint and he had a string of ex-girlfriends that lived in fear of him. One ex, Gillian Kane, had petrol poured through her letterbox and set alight. They had dated between 1978 and 1981. For years the Kanes lived in fear of Vincent threatening them. He had recruited a Dublin criminal to go to the home of Gillian's mother and assault her for a payment of £2,000. He had attempted to throttle their dog, only he was caught in the act by Gillian's mother. Of course, Vincent denied even knowing the Kane family until Gardaí brought Gillian into the same room as him, and he crumbled and admitted he knew her and did do what he was accused of. With this admission, detectives moved on to the real reason they arrested Vincent. They presented all the evidence they had on him, including witness statements from his girlfriend in 1982 and other witnesses that I have already mentioned. Vincent was driven to Tallaght Garda Station for interrogation. In subsequent testimony, he claimed he was deprived of sleep for the entire time and was physically and mentally broken through prolonged periods of violence, including hair pulling, slaps, and punches to the kidneys, and threats including one that he would be shot in the knees and elbows. Gardaí, of course, denied this. The Gardaí involved in these interrogations were the one and only John Courtney and Jerry Carroll from the infamous murder squad, nicknamed the Heavy Gang, which I have a playlist for if you want to check them out. Vincent eventually signed an alleged confession. However, his signature, two handwriting experts would later testify, was not his normal flowing signature. They were signed V. Connell, which he said was not how he signed letters or documents. The section of this alleged admission that led Vincent to being charged with murder read, quote, "What you don't realise, gentlemen, is I put all that out of my mind after that night. And I did have a few drinks on me. I remember meeting her outside the tents and walking down past the pub and into the field. In the field, I put my hand around her waist and she slapped my face. That's when it started. She might have slapped me again. I pushed her to the ground and I pulled her bra and top around her neck. I think she tried to scream. After that, I don't know. I just ran in a blind panic. I remember taking her handbag and throwing it away into the bushes, near where we were, or somewhere, I'm not sure. I got back onto the main road over a wall and ran back to the beer tent." This was supported by his then girlfriend. She said he was absent from her and the company they were keeping for around 40 minutes, between 11:40 p.m. and 12:20 a.m., something with which Vincent and others in their company disagreed on. This woman gave numerous accounts of that night, and to me she would not be considered a reliable witness. But this latest narrative suited the Gardaí.
Connell was brought to the Dublin District Court from Tallagarda station, where he had been held for questioning since Sunday evening. He was driven quickly into the yard, where Gardaí covered his head and ushered him into a late sitting of the court before Justice William Hamill. There, the charge of murdering Patricia Furlong of Dundrum at Glencullen on July 24, 1982, was formally put to Connell during a short hearing. Detective Sergeant Jerry O'Carroll, nearest the camera, told the Justice that he arrested Connell at a city centre bar on Sunday evening. He detained him under the Offences Against the State Act on suspicion of committing arson at Dangan Park in Crumlin on the 15th of May 1982. The court then heard that Chief Superintendent John Courtney, seen here on the left, made an order yesterday afternoon extending by a further 24 hours the period for which Connell could be detained for questioning. Detective Inspector Michael Canavan of Crumlin asked that Connell should be remanded in custody for a week, and that was granted. Before Connell left the court to be taken to Mountjoy Prison, the Justice was told he was not working at present and that he wished to apply for legal aid.
The evidence was sufficient for a jury to believe Gardaí and to convict Vincent in December 1990. He was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Patricia. During the trial, the jury did not hear evidence from the syntax expert, who stated he believed the admission was entirely concocted. More importantly, the jury was also prevented from hearing testimony from the witness who had seen Patricia in the company of a young man who was known to her and Patricia and who at the previous year's festival had tried to strangle her. She named the young man and said she had seen him with Patricia and another young man who was the owner of a red Ford Escort. Other key evidence did not come before the jury, including striking testimony from people who knew Patricia and had seen her after the festival had ended at 2:30 a.m. Vincent, 31, not exactly a young man, and his girlfriend did agree on one thing, that they had both left together at 12:30 a.m. Vincent and his defence team filed an appeal straight away against his conviction on the grounds that he had been denied access to a solicitor, deprived of sleep, ill treatment, all during his interrogation, and that his admission of guilt in the murder of Patricia was not true, but written by Garda detectives. It would be another 5 years before the appeal would be heard. In February 1995, 5 weeks before the trial was to begin, Patricia's mother would pass away. She would die never having to know that Vincent Connell would win his appeal and become a free man after spending 5 years in prison. The Court of Criminal Appeal overturned his conviction. Justice Egan ruled that Vincent had indeed been interviewed for more than 4-hour periods at a time, which breached Garda guidelines, and that he had not slept during the 48-hour period of detention. The judge rejected the claims that Vincent didn't have access to a solicitor when Gardaí provided phone logs showing one was contacted upon his arrest. But they didn't take into account that he was arrested on a Sunday and no solicitor was open, and none were contacted on the Monday morning, and in the following hours he was held in detention. The Gardaí also provided job cell logs showing that Vincent was checked on every half hour, and it was he who refused to sleep during down periods of questioning. When Vincent was released from prison, he pleaded guilty to 4 charges of assault on his ex-girlfriends, causing bodily harm between 1978 and 1989, and was sentenced to 12 years. The 5 years served were taken into account, and the final 7 were suspended due to good behaviour while in prison for the murder of Patricia. Vincent said he pleaded guilty to avoid another lengthy trial, as the murder trial had lasted a total of 42 days, the longest trial ever held up to then. In 1998, Vincent, 46, died from a massive heart attack while living in the UK. He had continued over the years to proclaim his innocence of Patricia's murder up until his death. He had also taken the precaution of having a sample of his blood taken in an attempt to establish that DNA evidence from the body of Patricia could finally be tested with advanced technology and prove his innocence. This would never happen. At the time of his appeal, 12 years after the murder, evidence was given in court that samples taken from the body had not been saved. Give me strength. Before his death, Vincent, while still living in Terranure in Dublin and before moving to the UK, had intended to apply for a miscarriage of justice certificate in his case. He was also going to begin compensation proceedings against the state under the Criminal Procedure Act of 1993. And finally, he was going to sue Detective Inspector John Courtney because of how he portrayed Vincent in his book. Senior Gardaí have insisted that there will be no reinvestigation of the murder of Patricia. Her murder seems to be excluded from the other cases of women missing or murdered in Ireland. Retired Detective Inspector Eamon O'Reilly would give an interview to the Evening Herald newspaper and was later reprinted by the Irish Independent in 2011. He said Vincent was one of the most unusual criminals that he had ever met. He never seemed to mind being in custody and would just keep talking and talking. He vividly remembers that when Vincent was charged with murder, he insisted on playing the tune called The Piano Man on a guitar which he had on him when he was arrested the day before. He has no doubt in his mind that Vincent Connell did murder Patricia. Patricia's sister Angela said upon hearing of Vincent Connell's death, quote, "You never wish anybody dead, it's just that we can end this chapter in our lives now, once and for all. She was very pleased for the other women that lived. We had no doubt on the evidence in court he murdered Patricia," she said. She often saw Patricia's friends over the years and wondered if she had lived what she would be like now, and whether she would be married and have children. I feel at the end of this story about Patricia, she got lost and the concentration went on Vincent Connell. Sometimes this cannot be avoided. This reminds me of the Ian Bailey and Sophie Tuscan de Plantier case. So many questions left unanswered, so many witnesses and different men seen in Patricia's company. But was it just the one man seen by different people? Was the one man Vincent Connell, or a completely different man altogether? Did Patricia know Vincent Connell, as he did work as a DJ in the Top Hat roller skating disco, where Patricia went often? Why did they all decide to go to the festival that night? Why not go out in the city, where there were late discos, most of them only opened when the pubs closed? To say the least, it was a confusing and frustrating case, and the information was conflicting. Unfortunately, reporting was not done like it is today. I feel the Gardaí think they got their man and he got off on a technicality, and this is why they have put the case to bed. There is no doubt Vincent Connell was an evil man, and he did at least try and murder 2 of his ex-girlfriends, one by arson and one by manual strangulation. But there was no physical evidence against him, and forensics in 1982 were not what they are today. The one sample they had of evidence was not kept, and so no new evidence could be compared. Even when they took the first statement from Vincent, they had to go to the house to get a second one because they lost the first one. There is no denying it, and you may not agree with me, but the Gardaí messed up here. And knowing the murder squad, or the heavy gang as they were called, was involved in the interrogations was a red flag for me, and I knew there'd be no justice for Patricia. Their egos got in the way of them doing their jobs properly. Their attitude was conviction by any means, and will worry about the consequences later. Now, I'm not saying Vincent didn't do it, but this crowd failed in securing a conviction that could not be overturned. Sorry, this is a bit of a rant, but I feel strongly that these particular Keystone cops let the Furlong family down. All I can say is rest in peace, Patricia.